Welcome, everybody. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Fair District's Georgia Town Hall. We're letting people in, and at some point we'll get started here.
So while people are coming in, maybe we want to ask them to identify themselves.
Yeah, not a bad idea. We're gonna be talking about, we're gonna be starting in a few minutes. Meantime, if you would be so kind as to be sure your screen shows your full name. Okay. And we have the chat function activated. The chat is, I have a different screen than everybody else, don't I? The chat button is either the top or bottom of your screen, and you can click on that and chat to everybody and tell us where you're from. We'd love to know where you're from as you enter here. Okay, people are still coming in, but we'd love to see where people are from. So please, we'd be grateful if you would do that. Welcome, folks. Just to take note, the town hall is being recorded. I think Zoom already has told you that, but just in case it hasn't. And the recordings will be on the Fair District's website. We'll wait a couple more minutes. I think people are coming in at a pretty good clip. Oh, excellent, excellent. Wow, I'm getting them backwards, but you guys are from all over. Oh, this is wonderful. Augusta, Mableton, Dahlonega, Swanee, Atlanta, DeKalb, Atlanta, Conyers, Georgia / Boston, Kingsland, Cobb County, local folks, Roswell, excellent, excellent. Atlanta, Peachtree Corners, DeKalb. Yeah, it's starting to feel unincorporated DeKalb is starting to feel strange, isn't it? It's starting like it's got a name all its own. Oakland, California, Decatur, Atlanta, Druid Hills. Excellent, excellent. So nice to have everybody joining us tonight. Just a couple more notes. Just to remember that this town hall is being recorded, and the recordings will be available on the Fair District's website. So in addition to putting your location, where you're from on the chat, at the end of this evening, there will be a time for questions and answers. And the questions, please put your questions in the chat so that we can answer them later on. So we're getting pretty close to starting. Are people still streaming in here? I haven't been watching.
Yes.
Okay, we're just still gonna wait a few minutes to see who is gonna show up in the next couple of minutes, because we have a few minutes before we need to start.
You can go ahead and start, Linda.
Okay, all right. I think there will be more people coming in. So if anybody has a question, hopefully they'll put it in the chat. So let's get started. Oh dear. I didn't make the slide move forward.
You see the arrow at the bottom?
Ew. Oh, excellent. Good. Not where I expected it. Yes, good. Welcome to our Fair Districts Georgia Town Hall. This evening, we'll be discussing this travesty of mid-cycle redistricting in Georgia. Fair Districts Georgia is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that works to end electoral map rigging in Georgia. I'm Linda Gooding. I'm an emerita professor of microbiology and immunology at Emory University in the School of Medicine. And I've been a member of the Fair Districts Georgia Education Committee since its inception in 2016. We have a really full program and I think really interesting, exciting program for you tonight. Our first two speakers are also members of the Fair Districts Georgia Education Committee. First will be Karen Davenport, our current Education Committee Chair since 2021. Karen was formerly worked in the Decatur City Schools as an educator and administrator and is a faculty member at Georgia State University. And after Karen will come Mary Lou McCloskey. Mary Lou is former education chair and committee member since its inception as well in 2016. She's been an author, a teacher, and an educator in the area of English for speakers of other languages. And so after Karen and Mary Lou, we will have yet another speaker. We are very, very fortunate to welcome our special guest speaker, Georgia State Senator Elena Parent, whom we will introduce further later. So I'd like to welcome Karen Davenport, who will outline our presentation and tell us a bit about the history of gerrymandering in Georgia.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Linda. Well, it is always important to remember that our country's democracy requires free and fair elections. Free and fair elections. Free and fair elections, we must have both. We must have both of those. Now, voting rights is defined as every citizen having the right and opportunity to vote. Fair maps are defined as maps that give citizens equal opportunities to be represented. Limiting voting rights and creating unfair maps are tools used by a minority of number of representatives to exert power and control over the majority voting population. Next slide. Our focus today is on one particularly harmful type of gerrymandering, mid-cycle gerrymandering. Here are the three big questions that we will address. Number one, what is the history of redistricting in Georgia? Number two, how does mid-cycle redistricting exasperate unfair maps? And number three, what can we do to stop the travesty of mid-cycle gerrymandering? We hope to leave you ready to join with us in the effort to force a change to how our legislators are elected in Georgia. So let's start by reviewing a bit about what redistricting is, what gerrymandering is, and the history of redistricting and gerrymandering in Georgia. Every 10 years, there is an official count of our state's population. That includes collecting social and economic information such as occupations, ages, incomes. The census tells us who we are and where we are going as a nation, and helps our government decide how to distribute funds and assistance to states and localities. Redistricting is the process of redrawing congressional and state legislative lines to create equal-sized districts. Our representatives are then elected from these districts. When redistricting is conducted fairly, it accurately reflects population changes, racial diversity, and community interest. It is meant to be used by legislators to allocate representation equally in the U.S. Congress and the state legislature. Now, the law requires districts to have equal numbers of voters, but you can draw the lines in ways that are strikingly unfair. When lines are not drawn fairly and equally, we call this gerrymandering. The picture on the left shows a state with 50 precincts, with 60% blue voters and 40% red voters. We can organize these precincts into districts many ways. Now, in the middle picture, they have been organized so that every one of the 5 districts has a majority of blue voters. Divided this way, the red voters will get no representation. In the third picture, it looks like the red voters drew the lines because even though the majority of voters are blue, red manages to get a majority of the districts, and voters are still not equally represented, this time in the other direction. When you look at this slide, you can see what's at stake in redistricting. You can see what's at stake in gerrymandering when that is used in the process of redistricting, when you have gerrymandering taking place. First of all, the legislators can win re-election with minimal effort and expense. They can stay in office as long as they choose, gain influence, build a political career that lead to higher office, and they can serve only a small amount, their constituents, not all the citizens. The parties can retain the majority or even a supermajority in both legislative chambers. They can control what legislation is introduced and passed. They can control the committee's assignments, the chairmanships, and again, they can work on a career path for the party legislators. And when we have this gerrymandering going on, citizens should accurately represent the legislators should accurately represent voters' choices. But basically, when so much gerrymandering is taking place, citizens really don't have a voice in the state government and state law, and they are not taken seriously by their legislators. Citizens lose their rightful power to choose. Legislators don't accurately represent voters' choices. Now I'd like to turn the floor over to Mary Lou, and she's going to tell us about how mid-cycle redistricting can make a bad situation worse. Mary Lou?
Thank you, Karen, and welcome everybody. I'm so glad that you're here today. Our next question is, how does mid-cycle redistricting exacerbate unfair maps? First, let's define mid-cycle redistricting. We're still on the previous slide. Our U.S. Constitution requires redistricting in every 10 years after the census. In many states, this is the only time it's done. But the Constitution leaves many of the decisions about how exactly it's done to the legislatures in the states. And in our state, the Georgia legislators have decided to redistrict more often than every 10 years. That is what mid-cycle gerrymandering is. Gerrymandering in between the 10-year censuses. And as we will demonstrate, mid-cycle gerrymandering is always done to gain political advantage. So let's look at this picture. Our first example of mid-cycle redistricting is from 2006. To understand the backdrop, let's recall the ugly Democratic gerrymander from 2001 and what happened as a result. Following the 2000 election, the census, Democrats drew very badly gerrymandered maps. In 2002, the Democratic statewide vote share dipped. The vote share dipped below 50%, but because of their gerrymandered map, they still had a majority of the district representatives. The Republicans sued them, in federal court and won. And by 2004, the court drew a new state house map for the 2004 election. And in that election, Democratic vote share dipped even further to 40%, and they lost the majority of the state house. That means that the map was fair because when a Republican won the majority of the vote seats and they won the majority of the votes. We'll talk about seat share and vote share some more. Vote share and seat share are really important to compare to find out if districts are fair. Okay, next slide. In this chart, this shows the result of the Republican mid-cycle campaign in change in 2006. The 2004 election was the one with the last 2 decades that used maps drawn by a court instead of politicians. The result was considered fair. Yet, 2 years later, Republicans redrew the maps anyway. Why? As the chart shows, they were able to gain 10 seats in the legislature, even though their statewide vote share stayed the same. Okay, so the statewide vote share is 57.9%, the gray bars, and the seat share went from 96 seats to 106 seats due to their gerrymandering for political advantage. Remember that vote share and seat share don't have to actually match. The trend is what's important. So when vote share goes up, seat share should go up. When vote share goes down, seat share should go down. Okay, next, let's look at the next slide. So the 2004 election, we did that one, right? Our second example of mid-cycle gerrymandering is from 2012. Following the 2010 census, the Republicans redrew the maps in 2011 in a special legislative session. However, in the 2012 legislative session, they made more changes, altering 23 seats in the General Assembly. 23 different districts were changed and the maps were redrawn. In the 2012 election, Republicans' statewide share declined. So the vote share went down, but because the maps were tilted in their direction, they gained a supermajority in the state Senate and a near supermajority in the state House. You can see that supermajority in the House seats right there. Here's the same picture of the 2012 election result for the Georgia Center. We see the same pattern. Lower Republican vote share, but a gain in seats, enough to gain a supermajority, which can overrule the veto. Okay, that's what was happening in the Senate. The previous slide was what was happening in the House. This is an example of how the gerrymandering was carried out in 2011 and 2012. Oh, we don't have the next, we want the map of Lawrenceville next. Lawrenceville, a city of 28,500 people, was almost 100% contained within the House District 104 before the gerrymandering. After the maps were drawn in 2011 and changed in 2012, Lawrenceville was cracked into 6 different, sliced up like a piece of pie. Despite there being, it's a small enough city to fit into one district, but it was sliced into 6 different districts that including outlying areas from the city. Lawrenceville voters were disadvantaged by not having a representative that they could call their own. Residents of small cities around Georgia have distinct needs regarding housing, employment, transportation, land use, and that's what the General Assembly they've always considered that and tried to keep political subdivisions and communities of interest together when they draw districts, but that all changed with the 2011 map. it appears that they now systematically break apart small cities across the state, reducing their representation in the General Assembly. Okay, next. Here's our third example of mid-cycle gerrymandering in what was happening in 2015. House Bill 566 in 2015 altered 17 Georgia House districts. Sadly, this bill passed the Georgia House 168-0. Democrats and Republicans joined forces for the mid-cycle event. The map here shows the changes to one specific district, House District 111. For House District 111, those green areas were added and the pink areas were removed to make House District a safer seat for the incumbent. So the incumbent could spend less time, less money, less energy campaigning and fundraising for re-election, and less time paying attention to voters. All they cared about were the primary voters because they were automatically guaranteed an election. In the past 2 decades, there have been 97 redistricting attempts in Georgia. 64 of them were successful. Not 664, 64. How do we know that mid-cycle redistricting is done for political advantage? The state was sued over the 2015 mid-cycle events. Gina Wright is the executive director of the Legislative and Congressional Reapportionment Office. That is the office that actually draws the maps under the direction of the legislature and then the redistricting committee. Her group draws the maps. And she admitted in the deposition that the objective was to make districts safer for incumbents. Here's what she said. The objective was to make these districts, if at all possible anyway, better for the incumbents to get reelected. So if the legislators said, draw a map so it's safer for me, that's what she did. And that was the goal, was to make it safer. And we know what the trouble that having those safer district is. It makes us less democratic. Here's a graphic of redistricting and gerrymandering in Georgia between 2000 and 2020. Each vertical line in the graph, in this graphic, represents a redistricting event. Okay, those are all those big lines and little lines are redistricting events. The fat lines are the decennial events. The first blue fat line is the one that Democratic gerrymander that happened in the year 2000, 2001. Then 2004 is the gray line. That was the one drawn by the courts. The third fat line is the 2010-11 redistricting done after the census done by Republicans. And all the skinny lines are mid-cycle gerrymander attempts. Now the tall lines, the ones that go all the way to the top, are the ones that were successful. And the shorter lines are the ones that were not successful. And you can see there look like about 6 mid-cycle gerrymanders were successful, and they affected about 64 districts. So 6 successful mid-decade adjustments resulted in 64 changes. You can see how that changes what's going on, and it's all for political purpose. Next. This is a little more complex graphic history of gerrymandering in Georgia from 2000 to 2020 that describes each event. Okay, first event, click. What happened was the 2000 census. After the 2000 census, the Democrats drew a badly gerrymandered map, and as a result, next box, what happens in 2003 and 4 was that the Supreme Court came in, said it wasn't fair, and the map was redrawn by the courts. Okay, next event was right afterwards, the Republicans, having a majority, did a mid-cycle gerrymander in 2006, just 2 years later, and changed 11 General Assembly districts and all 13 congressional districts. Okay, the next event in 2010, after this, there's a census event in the sense, and then afterwards, the Republicans immediately afterwards did a mid-cycle gerrymander, and they ended up changing another 23 Georgia General Assembly districts. All right. Next, 2015, you saw that map change it. Another 17 districts changed in 2015. Next, this is about all the proposals for laws or constitutional amendments for independent redistricting commissions. Every legislative session this was proposed. Many of the proposals involved our Senator Elena Parent, who's going to be speaking next. So none of those have passed. Nobody's willing to go along and make pass laws to make our elections more fair yet. We want it to happen, but it hasn't happened yet. One more view of this 20-year period is of a graphic that shows what happened with seats and votes. It's another way to illustrate the effects of mid-cycle gerrymandering. State House is the example here. It shows that first, mid-cycle redistricting in 2005 followed the court drawn maps, and that were fair and it was unnecessary. Mid-cycle adjustments in 2012 created Republican supermajority, even though the Republican vote share was declining. And third, the mid-cycle adjustments in 2015 helped sustain the partisan advantage. So what happened was, you can see in 2004, when the vote share and seat share was almost equal, and then in 2006, the gerrymanders started to separate the vote share and the seat share, so that it turns out that they weren't in a balance at all, which meant lots of people were not fairly represented by their elected officials. When the Democrats controlled redistricting, it's the period with the blue background. The GOP were in the period with the red background, and you can see how the seat share changed when that happened. Finally, when the GOP controlled, not yet, when it controlled everything, the voter preference and seat share aligned. The only time they aligned in Georgia in the last 20 years was after the courts drew the map. Okay, finally, to summarize, since 2005, there have been 97 mid-cycle gerrymandering attempts in Georgia. 64 districts were changed successfully, all as a result of mid-cycle politically motivated gerrymandering. Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Linda. I have one more slide. Okay. So what's at stake? Mid-cycle gerrymandering accelerates Georgia's gerrymandering. What happens with gerrymandering is it leads to, first of all, uncontested seats. It leads to districts where nobody even wants to bother opposing the incumbent because there's no chance that they will win. It leads to underrepresentation. People aren't, because the primary voters are determining who gets elected, everyone isn't represented by their elected official. It leads to, for voters, it leads to a polarization. Because these primary voters are the extreme voters, they force us to further out into the extremes and make further differences between the parties, the two different parties. And it finally is also discouraging to voters when we don't feel there's a real choice. it is discouraging and they feel like their votes might not make a difference. And we don't want that to happen. Now I'd like to turn it over to Linda, and Linda's going to introduce our next speaker.
Thank you so much, Mary Lou. That I'm just so happy that I am with great pleasure able to introduce my state senator, Elena Parent. Elena, who in addition to being a state senator, is a wife, a mom, and an attorney. She served in the Georgia House from 2011 to 2012, and then she was herself gerrymandered out of her district in 2012 in that mid-cycle redistricting you just heard about. She turned right around, and in 2014, she ran for and was elected to the Georgia Senate, where she serves today. Senator Parent has been a leader in Georgia in working toward fair redistricting since her election to the Senate. In each session since 2014, she's introduced legislation to provide transparency, standards, and independent citizens commission to draw the election maps. So, one comment, the conversation we haven't had, Elena, is whether or not you want to use our slides. So let us know, and I will silence myself.
Well,
Senator
thank you,
Parent.
Linda. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you so much, Linda, and thank you, Mary Lou, and everybody at Fair Districts, Georgia. It always gives me great pleasure and heartens me in my efforts down at the Capitol to see the great work that Fair Districts, Georgia has been doing and is continuing to do with these new education tools on something that really doesn't get enough attention, which is mid-cycle redistricting. As far as the slides, my plan will be to sort of try to touch on the topics that are on the slides and, add some other things in as we go along. I hope that everyone can hear me fine. I am joining you from a house in Ansley Park because I managed to double book myself, and I'm very grateful to Fair Districts, Georgia for making it work for me to Zoom in from this other event, which is not a political event, because obviously you all would have taken precedence. It is actually that my husband and I agreed to co-chair our church's annual fundraising effort. And one of the neighborhood gatherings that is part of that effort is tonight. So that is where I am, but they've given me a nice quiet bedroom so that I can focus on you guys on this very important topic. So many of you know that mid-cycle redistricting was going to be more difficult for the party in power to accomplish prior to the kind of meat and bones and heart of the Voting Rights Act, the pre-clearance formula being struck down by the Supreme Court. So in recent years, it has been easier to make changes like that because the new laws, the changes, new maps, new voting rules, et cetera, can go into effect without being cleared as they were previously, based on Georgia's prior history of discriminatory behavior around voting laws before that particular pre-clearance formula was struck down. And Congress, despite some efforts earlier, immediately after it was struck down, has not updated the formula. The Supreme Court basically said, this formula is outdated. You're welcome to pass a new one. And of course, that has not happened, which is indicative of, I think, the threats to democracy that we are facing. And the reality is, and then I'm going to get back to the specifics of what we're talking about with mid cycle redistricting, because I know that's specifically what we're talking about, but it's all part of the same sort of puzzle with this similar motivations driving a lot of what we're seeing. And that is that currently the Republican Party, even though both parties have been bad actors, currently the Republican Party, you know, has not won the popular vote in a presidential contest in a number of successive elections. And they have become a party of a base that is a shrinking part of the overall population. So they are unfortunately uniquely incentivized to try to win with a non-majority coalition, right? So that's what is underpinning a lot of this. Looking at the political landscape now, I'm like, how is it that we had basically unanimous approval of pre-clearance back in the day, right? Because now you really can't imagine such a thing. So we don't have, long story short, obviously, we don't have the Justice Department or the feds to help us anymore ensure that extremely egregious, racially discriminatory, or excessively partisan gerrymanders go into effect, both when we redistrict at the conclusion of the census and any sneaky changes that are tried to be made mid-cycle. Now, I can think of only a couple instances where mid-cycle redistricting would be appropriate. If there were to be somehow a data dump into the census where something was proved to be erroneous from the count, the sentence, gosh, how do you say 10 years? I've forgotten somehow, but the once a decade redistricting process. If there were something proven to be erroneous with the data, that might be one reason to take a look if it were so ordered by courts. And really, that's the main and only reason that one can envision in a level, fair playing field where there might need to be an update to maps mid-cycle or mid-census. Court ordered for one reason or another. Fair enough. We may be facing that very shortly here in Georgia. Alabama is facing it, and some other states. So that, I think, is completely fair game. Outside of those very limited instances where the justice system has gotten involved, I think that it is plainly obvious that what you're dealing with is what we call very officially up to no good, right? The only other reason that you're going to do it is to try to gain advantage. And that means that you're just messing around with lines to try to lock in partisan advantage. And both sides have done it. Both sides can do it. And the losers are the voters for all the reasons that Mary Lou and other speakers outlined, which is the, lack of choices lead to less participation in democracy, which then can become a vicious cycle and really has serious consequences for the functioning of our government, our ability to be able to solve critical problems facing our country at home and as well as abroad, and numerous other consequences that flow from that just feed a system that isn't working as well as it should for the voters of Georgia. So what we would like to see is legislation that, absent a justice system court-ordered redistricting, order on redistricting, that changes are necessary to bring maps into compliance with our laws, that there is no reason to mess around with them, and we sort of see what you're up to, and that would be no good. And it's for political benefit and not for the people that we're really down there to serve, who are the people of Georgia. So we would like to see that introduced. It's a heavy lift. Look, but because here's why it's a heavy lift. People in power don't ever want to voluntarily give up power. That's why they haven't, advanced the Independent Redistricting Commission. They would rather just be able to do what they want while they're in power. They would rather see the Independent Redistricting Commission and laws curtailing the ability to gerrymander when they're out of power, right? I try to approach my public service in a way that is not so narrow and partisan, because I recognize the need for elected officials to be able to come together to solve difficult issues, and gerrymandering no doubt makes that sort of behavior that we used to expect our elected officials to be able to engage in and reach across the aisle much more elusive. So we have, of course, seen that having our own positive proposals around redistricting, independent commission, the Transparency Act, and this proposed idea related to mid-cycle redistricting have a secondary benefit, which even though they have not been enacted, which is that it gives us sort of the moral side of things to be upstanding and putting forth a vision that they then have to sort of tacitly admit that they're not going for. Which means you're on offense when and also primed to be on defense when necessary, when these odious bills crop up, which you will may have heard or will potentially see in a slide, has happened. And we've seen people that should know better, colleagues on my side of the aisle who should know better, signing on to these bills. And what the message I've tried to take forward is that there is no excuse. That is not something we do. No, right? And so we have to be primed to educate both Democrats and Republicans about this. And we have to be primed to show up at the Capitol to defeat sneaky and harmful measures that would attempt to redistrict mid-cycle. Now, I did see a couple questions that I want to address real quick. All right. Why did Democrats join Republicans in passing? Yeah, that was because Stacey Abrams approved that one for some reason. Now, we did not. So this vote that Ken is asking about in 2015, I was there, mid-cycle bill 168-0. You can see from the number there, 168, that we're talking about the House. When it got to the Senate, I went bonkers and certainly was a no vote. And I know that Vincent Fort was there at the time and he was a no vote. And since I wasn't in the House, I don't know all of then Leader Abrams's reasons for signing off on that. I remember analyzing it myself, and aside from the fact that I think, again, it's one of those bright lines, we just don't do it. We don't engage in it. I thought that it was hurtful to Democratic chances of gaining a seat. I think, without talking to her directly, I could be wrong about this, but my memory is that it may have been something where she felt like it was a bit of an even trade where a Democratic district got shored up and a Republican district got shored up. But again, bad, because in many ways, competitive districts are a good thing. So that's what I remember about that particular vote. And later on, Leader Abrams did vociferously oppose another egregious bill that many of you came out to lobby against and ensure that everyone down there knew that the public was watching. So Nancy asks, what factors help determine whether a mid-cycle redistricting was approved or not? All right, we have several factors. So back in the past, we did have to get approval. So not all of them might have been approved. Since then, we have seen, and in that one example I was just talking about, we've seen the turnout of hundreds of constituent advocates shining a spotlight and decrying the attempted gerrymander, and it worked. Ultimately, that particular bill was not enacted. And there was another one where they filed it, and just as quickly, this group and some others sprang into action to shine that spotlight. And again, it worked. They knew they were sort of caught and couldn't just get it done in the dark of night and backed off. I remember at least one bill, there were a number of organizations who put in a letter saying, we will sue if you do this. This violates this statute and that one, and prepare to face the lawsuit. That probably was also helpful. So again, the message there is real power in citizen engagement. The public does not like gerrymandering. They understand it a lot more than they used to. Awareness has really been raised. And I think since even 2015, when the House voted 168-0 on that bill, there's been a shifting of the tides due to the good work of this group and others. So you can kind of get folks to back off because they know it's unpopular in the public. And they kind of just hope to be able to do it before anyone notices. Ken says, Republicans have claimed that the reason they changed the maps in 06 was to undo bad 01 gerrymandering. So there were lawsuits around that time. Ken may know more specifically than I do right at this moment, but there were definitely, those maps were thrown out, those bad 2001 Democratic gerrymanders. And so I can't remember how much the legislature ultimately drew and how much the court drew. The court, I thought, drew the first one, but maybe they came back and changed it more to undo. It was a bad gerrymander, but it had already gotten undone by the courts. So that's suspicious to me. No, because the Republicans are going to gerrymander just as much. What they need to do is, if they think there was a bad gerrymander, they should go ahead and pass our legislation that they were on the receiving end of. They should go ahead and pass our legislation on the Independent Redistricting Commission, the Transparency Bill, et cetera, to ensure that there are no egregious bad gerrymanders, that they are the victims. Of course, really, it's the people of Georgia are the victims of. So I do not view that as a proper response to a gerrymander by the other side, a sort of tit for tat, you did it, so we'll do it. No. Mary Lou asks, are we introducing legislation like the Democracy Act? We have introduced that. And I need to go on and pull the exact bill number for you guys. I thought we had reintroduced both the Transparency Act and the Democracy Act again. Now, we may, again, be seeing a court order. So this may be a huge topic again within just a couple months, and it'll be a prime time to be at the Capitol, follow on the great work Fair Districts Georgia did during redistricting. The partnership with the Princeton gerrymandering project was very effective, and to again be talking about what the public expects and what the public deserves when it comes to this very fraught topic. Karen asked, and I want to thank Karen for her role in planning this. What actions do you think we can take as activists to change the power grab? Yes. So first and foremost, I agree with the slides that you all put together demonstrating how hundreds of activists coming out caused them to scurry like rats into the alley and not pass the bad bill. So that's probably the simplest and most achievable action that everyone can take. Advocating on the flip side for proactive, pro-democratic gerrymandering, anti-gerrymandering bills is also important. Now, the John, and Karen also asks about the John R. Lewis Advancement Act. That would be fantastic. As you know, it did not pass the Senate in Washington. And it actually was going to make significant changes in the redistricting space to take on partisan gerrymanders. And they did get a version of that Joe Manchin was in favor of. I think he changed it a bit, but it was still really good to get his, in order to get his support, but the filibuster in the Senate blocked it. And that was that. And now, and yes, go ahead.
Senator Parent, thank you so much. And I'm going to just maybe add a few more questions to the mix here and ask Mary Lou and Karen to come back as well.
Please do. I couldn't see because I had to open up the chat, and since I'm only on my phone,
Yeah.
that was all I could see. So thank you.
You were doing
Thank you
a
for
good
having me.
job of moderating the Q&A.
Oh, oops, I wasn't supposed to do that. Oh,
No,
damn it, I'm
no,
so
that's
sorry.
okay. No, that's okay. Because those are the questions we had for you. So
I'm just a mess. I'm a total mess.
no, that's great. So specifically on mid-cycle redistricting, and I know you and I have had that conversation. What do you think is possible in the current legislature here in Georgia in order to address mid-cycle redistricting, hopefully from a bipartisan perspective, and get something done?
I mean, the only way to get any of these pro-democracy, anti-gerrymandering bills done is to convince the Republicans that they don't want to, that they need to see a fair playing field, because soon they'll be in the minority and they don't want the possibility that they will have a very aggressive Democratic majority foisting on them the types of bills they've foisted on us, right? That's the only way to convince them to do it. The easier thing is to defeat bills that are egregious by shining a spotlight on them, but that's on the defensive side. Look, it is difficult. People don't want to give up power unless they have to. And as the state gets more purple, there's more and more of an opportunity to have them see the wisdom in passing these bills. I think a special redistricting session could provide a great opportunity to have a number of these conversations, actually. Look how much money it will cost the taxpayers that they pass illegal maps, right? It costs the taxpayers a ton of money, legal fees. We will have to go back into session. That costs all the taxpayers money. Why not just have it be fair from the beginning?
Mm-hmm.
That might be another thing to talk about.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I did want to kind of circle back on the trial, and I know this isn't directly mid-cycle redistricting, but we had 17 volunteers from fair districts that attended every single day of the trial. And,
Wow.
And completed reports. So if that's something you'd like to see, we certainly can share. But our thinking, I think, coming out of that was that a very strong case was presented for these maps being racially gerrymandered. And we're very anxious to see what Judge Jones comes out in his ruling. He is promising a ruling by Thanksgiving, but he also recognized, he said he knew it needed to be as soon as possible because it was such an important case impacting so many of the citizens of Georgia. So we're hoping to see that soon, and interested in your perspective on kind of the the word on the street at the Capitol in terms of this trial, and just what you started to speak to, which is, what you would anticipate happening should the decision be that new maps are needed.
Yeah, I think that we expect that there will be a ruling that new maps are needed. We do not know how prescriptive that order will be in terms of just number of districts or district numbers or areas of the state where the judge may feel that a majority minority district should have been drawn under legal precedent. So we do expect that we will be, well, we know that they are not waiting around. The Republicans believe that the maps will be tossed, right? Again, we don't know what the specifics will be. And so I know they are tentatively planning on either a special session or having us do it in January, which is not a good idea. But I believe that the later the decision comes, the more they might try to do that. My thinking is that their true rationale would be the sooner it gets to qualifying, the stronger an argument they might have to the court that the elections in 2024 have to proceed under the same maps, even though they've been invalidated because it's too close to an election to redraw them, which was one of the things Judge Jones had said before. So he really needs to get this decision out and make it clear that the illegal maps can be remedied before, we would have to run on them in 2024.
Yeah, and just for our audience's information, the illustrative maps that were presented in the trial had an additional Black majority district for the congressional districts in Georgia, had 3 additional Black majority districts for the state Senate, and had 5 additional Black majority districts for the state House. So as Senator Parent said, in the Alabama case that we've been closely watching and had the big Supreme Court decision today, that was around congressional districts only, and it said there needed to be one more Black, it was prescriptive for one more Black majority district. So we'll obviously be anxious to see what Judge Jones feels is the appropriate numbers, and hopefully have like Alabama's, the federal district court in Alabama set a deadline for getting those maps done. And when the legislature came back with non-compliant maps, they had a special master draft maps. So we will be gearing up and ready to support the process in a special session to be able to quickly analyze maps, not only for the compliance with what we anticipate the court order to be, but also for the issue we're talking about today, which is we want to make sure that there isn't unnecessary mid-cycle redistricting maybe in other areas of the map. So
That's
those
critical.
are things we will be watching for.
Yeah, so we upend the entire map so we can take more districts in other areas that aren't majority Black or whatever, right? And do an egregious partisan gerrymander.
Right. So I know we are really out of time, and we want to thank you so much for joining us, and thank Karen and Mary Lou for that great overview in terms of the history of mid-cycle here in Georgia. And with that, I think I'm going to turn it back to Linda to close us out.
Okay. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
I just want to thank everybody who's come to hear us all. Thank you to our wonderful speakers. This has been really interesting. Every time I hear this stuff, I learn something new. Last couple of things, we're putting a bunch of things in links in the chat, but a final statement from Fair Districts is, if we want to restore real democracy in America, we must eliminate the deliberate unfairness of gerrymandering. The political parties have taken America hostage. It is time for us to gain our freedom from gerrymandering rule by both political parties. Fixing American government requires fixing gerrymandering. Okay. So thank you again to everybody. Thanks to the participants. Watch for more announcements of future town hall meetings. I believe there's a link to an evaluation of this town hall in the chat. Yes, there is. Please tell us what you think, what you'd like to hear more of or less of. And remember, Fair Districts Georgia is an all-volunteer organization that's funded through donations. And I want to thank everybody for their support. And it's 8 p.m.
Bye-bye.